Welcome to Cleanergize. We are a team of 3 graduate students, Ahmad, Shahryar, and Hassan. In our solution for emissions reduction in Lost Hills, California, we conducted an impact assessment of the solar project. The analysis of scope 1 and 2 emissions includes both pre versus post-project emissions. This is followed by the plan for next steps by which we propose to reduce carbon intensity. To assess the impact of solar project on reducing scope 1 and 2 emissions, we first identified the carbon footprint of major sources contributing to scope 1 emissions. These are primarily caused by fuel combustion during oil and gas production and from the vehicles owned by the company. The table on the right shows emission calculations for these sources before the installation of the solar project. Using an estimate of yearly production of oil and gas and their published emission factors, we derive their CO2 equivalent and CH4 emissions. So, oil production has been causing 9,892 million pounds per year of CO2 and 0.4 million pounds per year of CH4 emissions. The emissions from vehicles were calculated assuming 1,000 company-owned vehicles used in a year. Finally, we arrive at a total CO2 equivalent emissions of 10,520 million pounds per year. Post-project emissions for scope 1 were not possible to calculate here due to unavailability of data on future oil and gas production scenarios. The scope 2 emissions are produced from electricity generated or purchased. We compared 2 conditions to calculate the emissions difference if the oil field has a solar project or if it doesn't. Without solar, 100% of the electricity of 1.75 million megawatt hours will be sourced from PG&E, for which the emissions are 873 million pounds CO2. With solar, which supports 80% of the electricity needs, the grid will only contribute 20% of the original emissions. However, the solar has emissions from manufacturing, transportation, and construction, represented by lifetime emissions factor here. These 2 combinations give the total emissions of 298 million pounds CO2 equivalent. The difference between these 2 is quite huge, about 575 million pounds CO2, whereas by installing solar panels, Chevron can reduce their scope 2 emissions by 66% for the next 20 years. As for task 2, here is an outline of the plan in terms of milestones and costs reducing scope 1 and 2 emissions. The solutions that are practical and achievable in a shorter time period are in bold text. The solutions are sorted in terms of 3 sections: electrical, process-based, and mechanical energy efficiency and auxiliary solutions. For optimizing pump jacks in phases 1 and 2, the major reason why they are split in 2 is because after a measure of success of phase 1 technologies spanning about 8 months, it would be determined if the phase 2 technologies are worth investing. Note that oil prices would factor in when considering optimizing pump jacks. For carbon capture and storage, we assume that more than 80,000 barrels of oil equivalent for a cost of $982,265. The timeline is based on first 2 quarters for planning and designing, and the latter for actual construction and incorporating it on the plant itself. For VFDs throughout the plant, this solution represents smaller investment with great returns of up to 5 times savings. Because of time constraints, we won't go into detail for more solutions mentioned here with the references as well. These are the technologies that we are proposing, especially the ones in bold text, when optimizing pump jacks in phase 1. The first technology uses air spring shock absorber as buffers to reduce the peak load and peak torque. The second technology is using flywheel energy storage device. The third technology is using VFDs for improved performance of beam pumping units. Each of these technologies require under $20,000 and can be accomplished in smaller timeframes, and they still have major carbon reduction potential. The phase 2 technique described here utilizes the existing pump jacks being retrofitted with a motor functioning in the regenerative quadrant as a generator and supplying power back to PG&E. This is based on 30 months of test data, a 75 horsepower pump jack in the oil fields of Alberta, Canada, which is a patented technology but is not widely used. The cost is $20,000 per unit, reducing 42 pounds of CO2 emissions per day per pump. More emission reduction technologies are given on the right, which have been sourced from the US Forestry Service document study in 2011. We chose these technologies because we believe they underpin Chevron's values and core competencies, especially of high performance and of protecting people and the environment. The ones on the blue are what we prefer. This is the last slide mentioning the references in our solution. This is all from us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, right on time. So this begins the 5-minute Q&A with the judges.
You indicated that you focused on the scope 2 in your first section, and you weren't able to determine the scope 1 because of some missing information. Can you elaborate on that, and what assumptions could you use to at least get a phase 1 estimate of that?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So here we calculated the existing conditions emissions from scope 1 with three sources, oil, gas, and vehicles. And so what was missing was we were not able to project really how much production will be in future. So we were thinking to assume, okay, what if oil production increases by 10%? So how much emissions will it increase? So we could have done that as well. So suppose if oil production increases by 10%, how much more emissions will it cause? So, but we will not have the actual data of projections. So we just skipped that part.
I see. Did you look historically to see the range of increases and decreases to give you a sense of maybe what assumption might be reasonable at this stage of your analysis?
Right. So we looked at last 5 years, not last 5 years, but 2014, 2018, and we looked at a trend line. We had about almost a decrease of around 1% every year, or something around that, in oil production and gas production. And so we can actually make projections based on that using a simple trend line.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks.
Excellent presentation. I really appreciate it. For the forecast that you have on the solutions, what do you think is the biggest uncertainty on the impact of the, first of all, viability and the economics of this solution?
So the factors are basically dependent on which technology we want to use. I mean, you would see that we have not highlighted any of the electrical solutions, and the basic reason was investment. I think it's essential whichever solution we are considering, regardless of it. For example, if we intend to optimize pump jacks, so some of the factors to consider would be, of course, the investment, the resources required, and the technologies which would need to be put in place, and then what are the returns. So, the factors are certainly something which is dependent on each technology, and the feasibility study, which can certainly be derived based on whichever technology we're using. But most of all, it all comes down to how much we intend to invest in the technology and what exactly is the return and how fast.
Thank you.
What technology that's currently more at the laboratory or trial phase do you think will have a step change in the emissions performance?
So the one which I've shown here, the phase 2 of pump jacks, this is something which is not implemented on a wide basis in a lot of oil fields. And the primary reason was that it was actually supposed to be an initiative in Alberta, Canada, but they did not want to go through it because it required a lot of changes to their infrastructure, and they wanted to stick with whatever they had. So what I see personally is that there is some sort of resistance with existing pump jacks, and because of the fact that they're generally not exactly off the shelf, but it's a pretty standard technology. So it's not as in the field as it is more in the lab.
And this technology has also have the upside of optimizing the performance and reducing the wear and tear on the pump jacks. They're familiar with it, Hassan. It's in a similar way. If you were king for a day, and for Chevron, if you want to do one thing that enables this big change, what would that be?
For Lost Hills, California, or general?
For losses, for this problem that you looked.
So personally, I think the biggest thing would be not only to have the process optimization, but also to make sure that whatever electrical system which I have right now. So there is a 20 megawatt hour battery storage, which is supposed to come in line in the fourth quarter, which was of 2020. I personally think that in order to get the maximum of the credits, it's essential to maximize that battery storage so that Chevron can benefit from their investment and also obtain their LCFS investment credits.
Well, thank you.
Time. Please start wrapping up your last thoughts.
I'm sorry?
Oh, it's time. So start wrapping up if you have anything else to say.
Yeah, so I think that actually was a good ending point. So thank you very much for sharing your presentation. You guys can stop your screen share and leave the meeting now, and best of luck.